Thanks, Gary, and thank you. And thank you to the Koch Foundation for funding this. I appreciate that. I've been an advocate of free markets and economic freedom for about 40 years. And during that time, I've noticed that when I've spoken about these issues to many audiences, the same kinds of myths and understandings come up again and again. So it's worth looking at those myths, and the title of my talk is 7 Myths About Economic Freedom. Now, I could have easily chosen 10 or 12. Why did I choose 7? Because I think these 7 are the most important. 7 is an important number, as Yankee fans and George Costanza well know. And I have time to cover all 7. Now, let me define my terms, because before giving the myths, I need to talk about what a free market is. A free market is essentially a situation in which everyone is free to make mutually beneficial deals, to agree on price, to agree on other dimensions of the product and service. They're free to enter those agreements or refrain from entering those agreements. It's a situation in which people are free to decide to be producers in a particular industry. Now, you might think, well, doesn't that describe our economy? And no, it doesn't. Because there are many occupations in which you need to get government permission in order to practice. I'll give one example. Cornrow braiding. In many states, you need to get government permission to do cornrow braiding. And does anyone know here how many chemicals are used in cornrow braiding? Anyone? Yes? 0. And yet, in some states, you have to go and get training in how to use chemicals so you can get a job in which you won't use them. So we have many areas of our economy where we don't have a free market. And I'm talking about the areas where we do and myths about free markets in those areas. Now, before getting to those myths, I'm going to give you one big bonus myth about, not about free markets per se, but about economics. Raise your hand if you have heard economics referred to as the dismal science. 1. Okay. Well, I guess it's a generational thing. When I was taking economics, there was a very common term that economics was the dismal science. Here's how you can one-up some of your professors or other professors you'll meet at other schools. Ask them why they think economics has been called the dismal science. If they're really sharp, they'll get right who said it, who used the term. It was an anti-capitalist author 200 years ago named Thomas Carlyle, a guy in Britain. But then if you say, now why did Thomas Carlyle call economics the dismal science? They'll probably tell you, if they think themselves well-informed, as I used to think I was well-informed, that they're thinking about a guy named Thomas Robert Malthus, who wrote an essay on population over 200 years ago, in which he said, agricultural output will grow arithmetically, straight line. Population will grow exponentially, which means ultimately we'll have mass starvation. That's why most economists think economics is called the dismal science. Wrong. Here's why it's called the dismal science. Here's why Carlyle coined that term. Carlyle noted that the free market economists, people like me of the day, who dominated economics in the early 1800s, strongly opposed slavery. Get that? Economics is dismal because the economists oppose slavery? What's this party animal's view of hopeful? That's incredible. Now, that in fact leads to myth number 1. And myth number 1 is that free markets promote racism. Many people believe that when markets are free, employers will use that freedom to discriminate against various races. The idea is mistaken. It ignores basic economic thinking and a whole lot of history. Let me quote the French philosopher Voltaire, who noted a couple hundred years ago how free markets actually create tolerance. Who here has heard of Voltaire? Okay. Here's what Voltaire said. Go into the London Stock Exchange, a more respectable place than many a court, and you will see representatives from all nations gathered together for the utility of man. Here, Jew, Mohammedan, that means Muslim, and Christian deal with each other as though they were all of the same faith, and only apply the word infidel to people who go bankrupt. Gary Becker, a University of Chicago economist who won the Nobel Prize in economics in the early 1990s, pointed out in his dissertation why free markets create tolerance. It's because of the profit motive. Think about an employer faced with two employees, and let's say it's a white employer and it's a white employee potentially or a black employee potentially. And the black employee is, say, somewhat more productive than the white employee. If the employer refuses to hire the black employee on racial grounds, he's giving up an opportunity to make money. And employers like to make money. And so what happens is that the employers who do discriminate give up those profitable opportunities. The ones who don't get those profitable opportunities. Therefore, the ones who don't expand and the ones who do discriminate contract. And that doesn't mean people won't discriminate, but it means the free market makes them pay a price for discriminating on racial grounds. Little story that not about race, it's much milder, but it makes the point. I'm a very cheap person. I went to a Dodgers game in the late 70s, and they gave away these blue Dodgers helmets. I still have them. So I live near San Francisco, where we have the Giants, and there's this big rivalry between the Dodgers and the Giants. So I go to San Francisco, and I'm wearing my Dodgers helmet. And this guy comes down, he's selling hot dogs, and he's way down the aisle, and I hold up my hand for a hot dog. He goes like this. And then what happens next? He takes the hot dog and it works its way down the thing. My $5 bill works its down. Why? Why did he sell me that hot dog?
$5 is $5.
Bingo. $5 is $5. And he's giving up that opportunity if he doesn't sell it to me. That just makes the point right there. Now that's why the clearest cases we have of discrimination on racial grounds are those that are enforced by government. Take streetcars in southern United States before the 1960s. In southern United States, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we started having electric streetcars. And they did want to segregate people. You know who they wanted to segregate? Smokers from non-smokers. And that's what they did. And then various racist city councils came along and said, no, you've got to discriminate by race. And they fought those laws. They fought them aggressively, but they didn't win, and those laws got enforced for decades. In other words, that was a case of discrimination, racial discrimination, enforced by law. Or consider one of the most extreme forms of institutionalized racism in the 20th century. South Africa's apartheid. Apartheid means separateness, apartness. It officially began in 1948, but an early version of it appeared in something called the color bar in the 1920s. Before the color bar laws were passed, white mine owners in South Africa wanted to hire black workers. There were lots of productive black workers. Which group of workers wouldn't like that? Someone said it. The white workers. And the white workers had the mine, had the union. There was the Mine Workers Union, entirely composed of whites. They had a big strike and they seized the mines. And they had a big march down the street. And here's what their banner said. You ready? Workers of the world unite and fight for a white South Africa. Karl Marx, meet David Duke. Do you know who David Duke is?
I think that was a no.
Okay. He was a racist politician in Louisiana about 20 years ago. Myth number 2. When markets are free, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Related myth, the rich stole it. The first myth, when markets are free, rich get richer and the poor get poorer, is half true. The rich get richer, the poor get richer, and everyone in between gets richer. Early 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter said it best. Silk stockings were a luxury about 400 years ago when he was writing about that era. Queen Elizabeth, not the one with the funny hat, but the one 400 years ago, Queen Elizabeth I during Shakespeare's time, owned silk stockings. The capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls in return for steadily decreasing amounts of effort. With economic growth, which is caused mainly by free markets, there's an increasing division of labor that gives rise to a situation in what was at one point a luxury for the few becomes a necessity for the many. I'll take one example. Cell phones. 15 years ago, starting to get common, but poor people didn't have them. Now almost everyone has them. And of course, they've gotten better. And in fact, when economic historians want to measure British standards of living in the late 18th century and early 19th century, 200 years ago, they look at one luxury item and see how much of it people had in their budget. Can anyone here guess what that luxury item was?
Silk stockings.
No, that's a good guess, but no. Something even men liked. It's a drink. Some of you drink it, I'm guessing. Tea. Tea was a luxury. Tea was a luxury. Now, of course, tea is no big deal. Or think about this. How many people in the 19th century had home heating without a fireplace? Non-existent. Now everyone has it. Or think about refrigerators. What did your grandparents call a refrigerator? An icebox. You know why? Because it had a big block of ice sitting on top. Heat rises, cold air falls, and that's how they cool things. And now, of course, virtually everyone has a refrigerator. Or how about this? Who was the wealthiest man in America early in the 20th century? Someone said it. John D. Rockefeller. At its peak, his net worth in today's dollars would be about $200 billion, which would make him richer than Bill Gates and Warren Buffett combined. But think what you have that he didn't. He couldn't watch TV, play video games, surf the internet, or send email. During summer, he didn't have air conditioning. For most of his life, he couldn't travel by airplane. He didn't even have a 1G. And here's the big one. If he got sick, he couldn't use penicillin. He couldn't use antibiotics. They did not exist. The son of Calvin Coolidge, who was president from 1923 to 1929, played tennis too hard in the White House tennis courts one day, came in with a blister, and died. That wouldn't happen now, but they didn't have penicillin. So, here's a little test for you. Who here, knowing that, would trade places with Rockefeller? Raise your hand. Who here, knowing that, would not trade places with Rockefeller? So, a lot of in-betweens. Who here is in-between? Not sure. Okay. But the ones, not the majority, the plurality of you said you wouldn't trade places with Rockefeller. So that says you think you're better off than Rockefeller. You think you're better off than the richest man in the world 80 years ago. So that's telling you the poor got richer. Myth number 3. Free markets degenerate into monopoly. That's false. Why? People have this idea that competition is this really delicate plant like an orchid. Requires just the right amount of moisture, the right amount of sunlight, just everything perfect. Wrong metaphor. Competition is like this hardy weed that you have to keep stomping to prevent from growing. Why? Because when there's a monopoly, there are monopoly profits. Why do you take economics? When there are monopoly profits, what happens next? What do other people want to do? Join the business. Enter. Get that money. Make that money. Monopoly profits attract entrance into the business the way honey attracts ants. So competition is this very hardy thing. Now, let me just give you an example, actually, from recent antitrust law where the Federal Trade Commission doesn't recognize this. A couple of years ago, the Federal Trade Commission investigated Apple for monopolizing the market for software used to run mobile devices. What was their argument? Their case rested on what economists call network effects. That once you're in a network, it's easier for other people to join the network, so the first mover gets the advantage. And so they said, Apple's in there, it's going to be hard for anyone else to compete. Here's the problem with that story. The first significant mover in that market was not Apple, it was BlackBerry. And so if Apple is actually getting this huge share, that says their theory is wrong. Because BlackBerry should have got that share, and it should have been impossible for Apple to get it. And so the main creator of durable monopoly, monopoly that lasts, is government. Think about the monopolies that bother you, that bug you. What ones come to mind? Yes. What?
Oil monopolies?
Really? That's what you think? Okay, well, what else?
Utilities.
Utilities, yeah. Come on up, there was someone up there, I had a hand up.
I was going to say the same thing.
Okay. There's one that I think you watch a lot of. Cable, right? Let's say you don't like your cable company, you don't want to go Dish. What do? You're stuck, right? Because almost all municipalities in the United States have chosen to allow one cable company. So the most, I'll get to oil in a second, but the cases we have that upset people most with monopoly are government-sponsored monopolies, government grants monopolies. So for example, taxi cabs. In almost every market, every city market in the United States, the government limits the number of taxi cabs. In New York City, the government limited in 1938 the number of medallions for taxi cabs. In order to run a taxi cab in New York, you got to have a medallion. 1938, they limited it. And so you've got to buy a medallion which can sell for $200,000 if you want to drive a taxi cab. However, there's one city in the United States where it's very easy to get a permit to have a taxi cab. And that city is Washington, D.C. Now, I think there's a reason for that. Who would be some of the major users of taxi cabs in Washington, D.C.? Yeah, senators, congressmen, their staffs. Who controls the budget and the policies of the Washington city government? It's not like any other. Congress does. So Congress is the consumers, and they understand that competition is good for consumers. Now, what about the idea of robber barons? Have you heard of robber barons? Raise your hand if you've heard of robber barons. Okay, what's a robber baron?
Vanderbilt.
Vanderbilt, in fact, was the person whom that term was coined to describe. Here's the problem. So if I'm saying that markets don't degenerate in monopoly, and yet there's this view that there were all these trusts out there 100 years ago that were monopolies, and people have the term robber baron to describe them. And Vanderbilt was the guy whom reporters used coined that term to describe. Anyone know how Vanderbilt made his money?
Railroad?
Later. First of all, how he made his big money. It's transportation, shipping. Here's what happened. The New York State Legislature had granted Robert Fulton a monopoly on shipping on the Hudson River. Vanderbilt came along and said, I think that monopoly is illegal because that is regulation by a state government of interstate commerce. And Vanderbilt said, I'm going to compete. I know I'm competing illegally, but I think I can win in court. And he competed, and how do you compete? By raising prices? Lowering prices. And he lowered prices substantially. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice John Marshall wrote the decision. You're absolutely right, Mr. Vanderbilt. That monopoly is illegal. We're going to allow competition. People in New Jersey celebrated. They named one of their steamships after Marshall. They were so excited because now they'd have competition. Vanderbilt also competed on ocean routes between Europe and here. In fact, it's possible that some of your great-grandparents, it's possible that you might not be here because your great-grandparents didn't come here or wouldn't have come here if he hadn't competed those prices down. So isn't that interesting? He's called a robber baron, and what's he do? Helps consumers. So the robber barons were neither robbers nor barons. Other than that, it's a great term. But did the other trusts of the 19th century monopolize? No, they did not. If the trust impact, have you heard of trust? That's where the word antitrust law comes from. These big organizations in 7 different industries in the United States in the late 1800s. If they had monopolized, you would have expected them to raise price, and at a higher price, what happens to the amount that people demand? It's less. And so what you should see is as they monopolize, if that's what's going on, as these trusts form, output in those industries should fall relative to output in general. But an economist in the 1980s did a study in which he looked at those 7 industries. And he found that real output in the 7 alleged monopolized industries rose by 175%. Well, real output in general for the whole economy rose by 25%. In other words, output grew in the monopolized industries by 7 times as much as the economy in general. So what was happening? They were taking advantage of economies of scale, cutting price, not raising price. So again, the robber baron story just doesn't fit the facts. Now, one of the things we think about when we think about big businesses is economic power, because if you're wealthier, you obviously have more economic power. And that's true. But economic power is very different from political power. Let me give an example. I live in a city called Pacific Grove. You heard of Pacific Grove? Right by Monterey? If I want to cut a branch off my tree, and the branch's diameter is more than 4 inches, I have to get the government's permission. There's someone sitting in some office in the city government whose permission I have to get. I have to fill out a form, I have to pay a fee, and I still might not get the permission. Now that's political power. That's this low-level employee having political power over me. Whereas the largest, most successful firm the largest by profit in the United States is Exxon. Can Exxon make me pay a penny? that I don't want to pay? isn't that interesting? The largest, most wealthy firm in the United States can't take a penny out of me without me consenting to it. That's a big difference between economic power and political power. Now, it's true that big companies sometimes collude with government to get government to use force on people. As one big developer in Connecticut did a few years ago, when the New London government took a woman's house, a woman named Suzette Kelo, and just said, okay, we're going to take it, we're going to use what's called eminent domain, we're going to pay you a low price for it, and then we're going to resell it to this developer. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court voted 5-4 to say, yes, that's all right. So yes, big companies can use the government to take people's stuff, but the crucial ingredient is the government. Myth number, by the way, feel free at this point to raise your hand if you have a question, you want to argue or ask for elaboration or whatever. Okay, myth number 4. Free markets are bad for the environment. In fact, free markets have generally been good for the environment. In my book, The Joy of Freedom, An Economist's Odyssey, I have a chapter on the environment titled, The Environment, Own It and Save It, in which I point out something that when you think about it is pretty obvious. When people own things, they treat them better than when no one owns them. The biggest environmental disasters in our history have not been in the United States or other countries that are relatively private property oriented, but in communist countries. Why? They regarded the environment as just this resource to exploit, and so there's a lake in Russia called the Aral Sea that is much smaller than it used to be, because the government came along in the 50s and 60s and said, we want to use that water to have this major irrigation project to produce agricultural output. It was a major disaster. They didn't get much agricultural output out of it, but they destroyed a lake. Or, let's do a little time travel. Let's go through Africa and look at the number of elephants in various countries and what's happened to the herds of elephants. There are some countries in Africa where there are very strict laws against poaching. And you know what? If that's all they've got, you know what's happening to the elephant herds in those countries? They're diminishing. It's very hard to enforce those laws. There are other countries in Africa in which the local villagers are allowed to share in the benefits of having elephants and allowing hunters to come in and shoot them. What's happening to the elephant populations in those countries? What do you think?
They're increasing.
They're increasing. Why? Who said that? Who said that? Tara. Why? Shara.
Are the locals breeding them?
Yes. And why do they, and they're also, the locals are preventing poaching. Now, why do the locals want to prevent poaching? Because they share in the benefits from letting these hunters hunt them. See, part of it is that it's not just poaching. Elephants to farmers are just huge rats, right? They'll trample your crop, they'll eat your stuff. They're a nuisance. They're just like very large rodents. And so if you then change the trade-off by letting them share in the benefits, you'll get more elephants. Or what country has the cleanest rivers of any country in the world? Scotland. What's true about rivers in Scotland? They are privately owned. And so the fishermen's associations own them, and they will sue someone who despoils them. There's a mountain in Pennsylvania called Hawk Mountain. In the 1920s, hunters came because there were a lot of hawks there, and they'd shoot hawks. And the hawks started disappearing. This woman came along in the 1930s and said, I want these hawks to stay. So she got a bunch of money together and bought the mountain and didn't allow hunting. And now hawks are flourishing in Hawk Mountain. So if you can own property, if we can have private ownership, we can have people taking better care of the resources. Okay, that's what I want to say. Okay, myth number 5. Free markets promote war. And the idea here is to get the resources we need for a growing economy, we need to invade other countries. Now, there's another alternative. We can buy stuff. We don't need to invade. How is Switzerland doing, roughly? Is it doing pretty well as an economy? Yeah? How many countries have they invaded in the last, 500 years? None. So we can get stuff by buying it, by trading. In fact, trade promotes peace. Many scholars who study war and trade have been aware of that connection. In 1750, Baron de Montesquieu stated that, quote, peace is the natural effect of trade. This was confirmed in a 2006 study by an economist at SUNY Binghamton and another one at Rutgers University. They showed that the higher the gains from trade between two countries, the lower the level of conflict between them. A doubling of trade leads to a 20% decrease in belligerence. In other words, trading nations cooperate more and fight less. Think about India and Pakistan that have been at each other's throats since Pakistan was formed about 60-some years ago. What has happened in recent years is trade between India and Pakistan has grown. And those conflicts have become less frequent and less serious. Or, gee, you might not remember this, I'm just thinking, I'm not used to having such an audience. Does anyone, let's see, 2001, how old were you? 10 maybe? Something like that? Okay. Does anyone remember what's called the Hainan incident? It was the U.S. Navy plane, and they shot down that Chinese Air Force jet, and then the Chinese Air Force made them land on Hainan Island. Anyone remember that? Yeah or no? No? Okay, well, it happened. Okay? And it was a big deal. It was like the third month of the Bush administration, and a lot of people were getting worried that this was going to turn into some major conflict between China and the United States. And it didn't. They resolved it peacefully. And the Chinese did take the plane apart, so they did all the little secrets. One of my students, by the way, I teach military officers, one of my students was on that plane. She said they were treated pretty well. They came back about 10 days later. Why? Why didn't it turn into this big conflict? Trade. There was so much trade by then between the United States and China, both sides had an incentive not to mess it up. Now, it's not a sure thing. Trade between England and France on the one hand and Germany on the other hand was very high just before First World War. So it's not a sure thing, but I'm just saying more trade, less chance of war. Myth number 6. Free markets promote stinginess. Okay, let's look at that. Let's look at one of the places with no free markets 20-some years ago, the Soviet Union. If you talk to people from the Soviet Union, you will find that when they come here, they are amazed by the amount of generosity that Americans have for each other. Who here ever looks at the British publication called The Economist? Okay? Who here's heard of The Economist publication? Okay, good. Well, let me tell you a little about that before I quote from it. You know, if you read The Economist regularly, you get this idea that they think we're a bunch of hicks. Like, you know, you guys, you Americans, you're the great unwashed. You know, when you had that revolution in 1776, and that was not proper, right? So when The Economist says something positive about America, that's quite striking. So here's what The Economist said in an article in the late 1990s about our generosity. The average American gives a little over 1 weekly paycheck a year to charity, the highest rate in the world. Moreover, half the country does volunteer work, averaging more than 4 hours of the week. The article also pointed out that contrary to the stereotype of Americans abandoning their elderly relatives in nursing homes, only 5.4% of over 65s live in an institution. Moreover, 8 out of 10 disabled elderly people live outside institutions, and 95% of the mentally handicapped still live with relatives. So we have relatively free markets compared to the countries in Europe, and we have more generosity. As I mentioned, I teach military officers at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I get officers from other countries. One of my students from Greece told me a year ago that when he came here and he brought his kids, he was so happy that his kids got to see America, got to see the way Americans deal with problems and help each other and don't wait for the government to do it. Now, I do think that's disappearing, but I think it's disappearing because government is doing more of it. Myth number 7. Free markets let employers lord it over employees, and without the compulsory union laws that started in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt, employees would be paid much less than they are now. Why is that funny?
We're trying to write it down.
Oh, that's why I'm seeing such studious people. Okay, I get it. Free markets let employers lord it over employees, comma, and without the compulsory union laws that started in the 1930s, without compulsory union laws, that started in the 1930s under FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, employees would be paid much less than they are now. That's a myth. What gives employees bargaining power is choices. The more mobile labor is, the more choices laborers have. When the railway came along, that made it much easier for workers to move. And in fact, let's think through what the effects of unions would be. Let's say a union forms in an industry. Under the 1930s labor laws, which still exist more or less today, if 50% plus one of the workers in a plant vote to have a union represent them, it represents everyone, including people who voted against. So it becomes the monopoly bargaining agent. So if it has a monopoly, what do monopolies do to prices? Raise it. So they raise the price at a higher wage. What happens to the number of workers who are employed? Law of demand. When they raise the wage, what happens to the number of workers who are employed in that industry? It decreases. Those workers go elsewhere and find other jobs in the non-union sector. If you've got more people willing to work in the non-union sector, what happens to wages in those sectors? They drop. So the main effect that economists have found of unions is not on overall wages, but rather they raise the wages of the union workers and somewhat lower the wages of non-union workers. Now some people say, well, unions aren't that great now, but there was this time when they were really important, really valuable. Not true. And in fact, if you look at the early history of unions, it was really the early history of racism. The number of unions that would not allow black people in them was huge. Who here has heard of W.E.B. Du Bois? Who here has heard of Booker T. Washington? Now, when you think of them, what do you think? Were they allies? No, they had very different views of how to make black people better off. But there's one thing they agreed on, and that was how harmful unions were to black people. Here's what Booker T. Washington said. The average Negro who comes to town does not understand the necessity or advantage of a labor organization which stands between him and his employer and aims apparently to make a monopoly of the opportunity for labor. Du Bois summed it up even more succinctly. He said, unions are the greatest enemy of the black working man. Well, those are my 7 myths. And so what I want to give you a little 5-minute thing about your futures and your careers in a minute. But let me just end my official talk by saying markets work well. They're why we're as wealthy as we are now. Let's not throw them away. Thank you. We have a little time for question and answer, but I want to give you a 3 or 4 minute thing, if you're interested, on how to think about your careers. Okay, so here's what I see happening with a lot of undergrads. Let's say you do well in school. A lot of you will. So you come out of here, you got good grades, you got a degree. But a lot of you don't know what you want to do next. So here's what I see people saying. I don't know what I want to do, so I'm going to go to graduate school. Or, I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'm going to be a lawyer. That's not good enough. Here's the problem. Let's say you go to graduate school, or let's say you become a lawyer. That takes 3 to 5 years. Now you're no longer in your early 20s. You're now in your late 20s. At some point you might want to have a family. Ever thought of that? Maybe. And then you have family, and you have a spouse, and you have kids. And you find out when you're maybe 30 or 32, you don't really like your job very much. And you feel stuck. Now the great thing about this society with how wealthy we are is you aren't stuck. You can turn it around. But it's a lot harder to turn it around when you have a family than to have made a better choice when you were 22. So you might say, well, how do I make that choice? Get information. Find out what you like. My nephew, who went to USC, wanted to become a lawyer. I said, how come? He couldn't tell me. I said, why don't you try working in a law firm for 2 weeks? He didn't. What's that telling me? He doesn't want to work there for 2 weeks? Will he then want to work there for 30-some years? I don't think so. He's now close to becoming a multimillionaire. He's 35 years old because he didn't go to law school. Now, I know I'm picking on law school, but I have known so many people who have become lawyers and have regretted it more than any other profession I know of. Well, you might say, well, wait a minute, so I don't go to graduate school because that's not clear cut. I don't become a lawyer, that's not clear cut. I don't get an MBA because that's not clear cut. What do? You invest in information about what to do. You volunteer for somewhere for a company and work for a while. You read about it, you investigate, you go to firms and talk to them. Oh, that's hard. Yeah. Is it harder than spending 3 years in graduate school or law school? Probably not, and probably you can do it a lot more efficiently. Will you make money while you're doing it? No, but you're not making money while you're going to law school or graduate school either. So that's my little bit of wisdom.